In the blazing Arizona sun of 1874, Elias Harper, a weary frontier scout, finds a wounded Apache woman lying near a dried-up creek. Her name is Taji, and she's been left for dead after a raid gone wrong. Against all odds, and against the prejudices of his fellow settlers, Elias carries her back to his cabin and nurses her through fever and pain. The Arizona sun burned like judgment from heaven. Heat shimmered over the red sands, bending the horizon into a mirage of gold and pain. By mid-afternoon, even the buzzards had grown lazy, circling high where the air was cooler. Elias Harper rode alone, the creak of his saddle the only sound besides the soft, rhythmic breath of his horse. The Civil War had left him half a ghost, too many faces lost, too many places that no longer felt like home. Now he lived by his own code: stay moving, stay quiet, and don't get attached to anything that bleeds. But that afternoon, fate didn't give him a choice. He found her near a dry wash, sprawled beneath a mesquite tree, little more than a heap of dust and bone and stubborn life. The first thing he noticed was the blood. It had soaked into the sand until it looked like rust. The second was her face, half covered by tangled black hair, one dark eye barely open, staring not at him but through him. An Apache woman. Elias froze in the saddle. He knew what that meant. Any white man who touched an Apache risked his neck. There were soldiers at the fort who'd shoot first and ask questions later. But he also knew the difference between life and death, and she was balancing right on that edge. He dismounted slowly, hand near his holster, but not on it. "You alive there?" he said quietly, though he knew she couldn't answer in his tongue. Her breathing was shallow, lips cracked, skin blistered from the sun. A bullet wound had torn through her side, the blood dried black. Flies hovered above it in lazy clouds. Elias looked around. The sand stretched empty in all directions. No horses, no tracks leading away. She'd been left behind. Something in him, the part that remembered his own brother dying in the mud at Shiloh, stirred. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling his canteen from the saddle. Kneeling beside her, he poured a trickle of water between her lips. She coughed once, eyes fluttering like a bird's wings before falling still again. "Don't you die yet," he said. "Not if I'm going to risk hell for you." He worked fast, tearing a strip from his shirt to bandage her wound. The bullet had passed clean through, ugly but survivable. He packed it with dry moss and tied it tight, praying she wouldn't bleed out before nightfall. Then he gathered her up in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, more air than flesh, as if the desert had already begun to claim her. Her head fell against his shoulder, a faint pulse flickering in her neck. Elias lifted her onto his horse, securing her as best he could. "Easy now," he murmured to both of them. "We got a long way yet." The ride back to his cabin took hours. The sun sank low, painting the sky in bruised colors, purple, red, and dying gold. Twice he had to stop and check if she still breathed. Each time she did, though barely. He talked to her just to keep himself sane, about the trail, the weather, the foolishness of saving strangers who could bring you nothing but trouble. By the time they reached the narrow canyon where his cabin stood, night had fallen. Coyotes howled in the distance, a mournful sound that echoed against the rock. Elias dismounted stiffly, his back aching, and carried the woman inside. The cabin was simple: one room, a table, a cot, and a fireplace where a few coals still glowed. He laid her on the cot and stoked the fire back to life. In the flickering light, her face softened. Without the blood and dirt, she looked young, maybe 20 at most. There was a faint scar at her temple, and her features were sharp and proud, the way desert rock is shaped by centuries of wind. Elias cleaned the wound again, boiled water, and fed her a little broth spoon by spoon. She didn't wake, but her breathing steadied. When he was sure she'd make it through the night, he sank into the chair beside her and rubbed the grit from his eyes. He knew he'd just made himself an outlaw in more ways than one. If the soldiers found her here, they'd hang him for treason or worse. But as he looked at her sleeping face, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. He didn't know her name, or what blood had been spilled to put her there. All he knew was that the desert had nearly claimed her, and he'd stolen her back from it. Outside, the wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the dry scent of sage and dust. Elias leaned his head back, listening to the sound, and said softly into the dark, "Guess we're both ghosts now." Morning came slow to the canyon, sunlight crawling over the rocks like something reluctant to wake. Elias Harper was already up, boiling coffee over the fire and watching the woman on the cot as she stirred beneath the blanket. Her eyes opened suddenly, dark, sharp, and wild. For a moment she didn't seem human at all, just a creature caught between fight and flight. She tried to sit up, gasped as pain twisted her side, and her hand went to the wound. "Easy now," Elias said quietly, holding up his palms to show he meant no harm. "You're safe here." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Her gaze darted around the room, the table, the rifle on the wall, the open door beyond it. Every muscle in her body screamed tension. Elias took a step back and poured water into a tin cup. "Drink," he said, setting it on the table within her reach. Then he backed away again, letting her decide. For a long time she stared at him, eyes narrow, weighing her chances. Finally, with trembling hands, she reached for the cup and drank. Some of the tightness in her face eased. "That's it," Elias murmured. "Ain't poison." She shot him a glance that said she wasn't convinced. He tried a different tactic. "Elias," he said, touching his chest. "My name," no response. Just the faintest tilt of her head. He tried again. "Elias." She watched his mouth, then whispered a single syllable, hoarse and careful. "Taji, Taji," he repeated. The word felt like smoke on his tongue. She nodded once as if confirming a contract neither of them had signed. From that moment they existed in a strange truce. Elias tended her wound each morning, changing the dressing and boiling water. She never thanked him, never smiled, but she allowed it, and that was something. Days passed. The desert outside stayed merciless, the kind of heat that baked thought right out of your head. Inside, the cabin filled with quiet sounds. The clink of metal, the rasp of Elias sharpening his knife, the low hiss of wind sneaking through the shutters. Taji said little, but her eyes missed nothing. She watched the way he cleaned his rifle, how he fed the fire, how he mended the torn sleeve of his coat. Elias noticed her watching, though he pretended not to. He'd known danger before, ambushes, shootouts, men with hollow eyes and quicker hands. But this woman unnerved him in a different way. There was power in her silence, in the way she carried herself even while half broken. One afternoon he caught her standing by the door, her hand brushing the latch. She froze when she realized he'd seen her. "You run out there, you'll die," Elias said softly. He didn't move closer. "No water for miles. Soldiers patrolling the ridge. Buzzards'll find you before I do." She didn't understand the words, but she understood his meaning. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time he saw exhaustion in her. Not just from pain, but from everything that came before. He hesitated, then took his canteen and offered it to her. She accepted it, this time without suspicion. That night, while she slept, Elias sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He wondered who she really was. A scout, a warrior, a refugee from one of the tribes the cavalry had burned out of the hills. He'd heard the stories. The Apaches were fierce and proud, and the army called them savages. But the man who'd seen the war knew that savagery wasn't bound to anyone's skin. When she woke screaming in the small hours, thrashing against the sheets, he was at her side in a second. Her eyes were wild with terror. He didn't touch her, he just spoke softly, words meaningless but gentle. Gradually the panic faded. She looked at him, breath ragged, and for an instant he saw something raw. Fear, grief, and a trust so fragile it hurt to look at. The next morning, she helped him gather wood without being asked. She couldn't lift much, but she tried. When he thanked her, she said nothing, only nodded once. Later, as he watched her sit by the doorway, sunlight catching the edges of her hair, Elias realized something had shifted. She was no longer just a wounded stranger in his bed. Some invisible thread now tied them together, woven from silence, danger, and the faintest trace of understanding. And though he didn't yet know it, that thread would soon pull both their hearts into a storm neither could survive. By the third week, the desert had softened its hand. The mornings were cool again, the kind of chill that carried the smell of mesquite and river dust. Elias Harper found himself grateful for the quiet rhythm that had settled into the cabin. The scrape of a wooden spoon, the whisper of fire, the faint shuffle of Taji's feet as she moved about. She was healing faster than he expected. The wound in her side had sealed to a pink scar, though she still walked stiffly. She spoke little, but when she did, her English, halting and broken, grew clearer by the day. Hot, she said one afternoon, wiping her brow as she carried water from the creek. Welcome to Arizona, Elias replied with a faint grin. Ain't no other kind of weather here. She didn't smile exactly, but her mouth twitched in a way that might have been close. It was enough to make something warm stir in his chest. In the evenings, he taught her words, pointing to objects, repeating slowly. Table, he'd say, tapping the wood. Chair, fire, sky. Sky, she echoed, eyes lifting toward the roof. He laughed softly. Not up there, girl, hanging outside. That's ceiling. Ceiling, she repeated, the syllables careful, like stones placed in a pattern. Sometimes she'd correct him, teaching him Apache words in return. Chi, she said one night, touching her hair. Chi? She nodded. Hair. Then she reached across the table, pointed to his, and said it again. Chi, Elias smiled. Guess we're teachers now. Each exchange chipped away at the wall between them. Slowly, Taji's wary silence gave way to something lighter. Not trust exactly, but the beginning of it. She began to hum as she worked, strange lilting melodies that rose and fell like wind over stone. He never asked the words. He didn't need to. The sound alone made the cabin feel less empty. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west, rare for that season. The wind howled through the canyon, shaking the shutters and sending dust spiraling through the cracks. Elias rushed to pull down the roof tarp that kept out the worst of the rain. Taji joined him without a word, climbing onto the chair to help tie the cords. The wind caught her hair and flung it across her face. She laughed, and not a sound of amusement, but of pure defiance, wild and bright. Elias froze, startled by the sound. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and for a heartbeat. It was like the whole desert had gone still to listen. When the storm passed, they stood together in the doorway, watching the rain sheet off the rocks and into the dry creek bed below. Pretty, she murmured, her accent curling the word into something softer. Elias nodded. Don't see rain like that too often. She turned to him then, eyes dark and curious. You alone here? He hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Yeah, he said finally. Been that way a long while. Why? He stared out at the rain again. Too many ghosts behind me, I guess. Easier to live where no one remembers your name. She seemed to think on that, then said quietly, Same. The single word hit harder than a confession. Two people from different worlds bound by the same emptiness. After that night, something unspoken shifted between them. When Elias caught her humming, he didn't look away. When she stumbled over a new English word, he didn't correct her too quickly. And sometimes, when their hands brushed as they passed a bowl or a tool, neither of them pulled away. He began carving small things in the evenings, little animals smoothed from driftwood. One morning, he left one on the table beside her blanket, a hawk wings spread wide. She held it in her palms for a long time, silent, then placed it back down gently. Fly, she said softly. Elias nodded. Yeah, fly. It wasn't love yet, not the kind either of them would recognize. It was quieter, more fragile, a shared breath in a house too small for secrets. But in that fragile bond, something alive began to stir between the soldier who'd lost his soul and the woman the desert had tried to kill. And though the world beyond that canyon waited like a loaded gun, for now, inside those weathered walls, there was peace. The peace didn't last. It never does in the desert. By late August, the air grew restless, the wind sharp, carrying whispers of dust and danger. Even the birds seemed uneasy, their songs short and cautious. Elias felt it first, that strange pull in his gut that had kept him alive through war and worse. Something was coming. That morning, he was splitting wood when Taji appeared in the doorway, her expression tight. She'd been down by the creek, washing clothes when she'd seen them. Riders in the distance, glints of sunlight on rifles. How many? Elias asked. She raised 4 fingers, then hesitated and added a 5th. He cursed under his breath. Patrol, maybe. Or worse. Taji didn't understand the words, but she read his tone well enough. Fear flickered across her face before she masked it. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow and thought fast. If those men were soldiers from Fort Crittenden, they wouldn't take kindly to finding an Apache woman living in a white man's cabin. If they were bounty hunters, it would be worse. He glanced toward the trapdoor hidden beneath the rug near the hearth. It led to a small space he'd once used to store grain. Get under there, he said quietly, lifting the rug. Taji looked at the dark opening, then back at him, defiant. No. Elias stepped closer, his voice low but urgent. Please, just for a little while. Soldiers see you here, we both hang. She hesitated, pride warring with instinct. But when the distant sound of horses drifted through the canyon, she gave a small nod. He helped her down into the narrow space and pulled the rug back into place, leaving only a sliver of air beneath the floorboards. Moments later, the riders appeared through the canyon mouth, 5 men in dust-stained uniforms, blue coats dulled by sun and grit. Their sergeant, a broad man with a crooked nose, hailed Elias as they approached. Harper, the man barked, dismounting. Didn't figure to find you still rotting out here. Elias forced a smile. Sergeant Boone, what brings you this far west? Raid last week, Boone said, spitting into the dust. Apache hit a mining camp near Tubac. Killed 3 men, took supplies. We're tracking survivors. You seen anything? Elias's pulse thudded in his throat. Can't say I have. Just me and the rocks out here. Boone squinted toward the cabin, suspicion in his eyes. You sure about that? Couple of tracks lead this way. Probably mine, Elias said evenly. Been out fetching wood. You know how this land keeps secrets, Boone grunted. Mind if we take a look? Elias's hand brushed the butt of his revolver, but he forced it away. Ain't much to see, but go on. The soldiers filed into the cabin, boots thudding on the wooden floor. Every creak made Elias's stomach knot tighter. Boone ran a hand across the table, then kicked at the rug near the hearth. For one horrifying second, Elias thought he'd lift it, but instead Boone just snorted. Hell of a life you live, Harper. Alone out here. Solitude suits me, Elias said. Less trouble that way. Boone looked at him long and hard, then shrugged. You hear anything, you ride to the fort. Command wants every scrap of information. These red devils are getting bold. The words burned like acid in Elias's ears, but he said nothing. The soldiers mounted up and rode off, their voices fading into the wind. He waited until they were gone from sight before pulling up the rug. Taji climbed out, face pale, eyes wide. She was trembling, from anger, not fear. They kill? She asked. Elias hesitated. They're hunting your people, yeah. Say they're keeping the peace. She looked at him for a long time, her gaze sharp as flint. Peace? She whispered. No. Dead. He had no answer for that. That night the fire burned low. Taji sat across from him, silent, her eyes lost in the flames. Elias tried to read her thoughts, but she was somewhere far away, somewhere beyond words and safety. Finally, she spoke. You lie. For me. Elias met her eyes. Had to. Why? He stared into the fire. Because I know what it's like to be hunted for the wrong reasons. For a moment, neither of them breathed. Then slowly, Taji reached out and laid her hand over his. A small, trembling gesture that said everything words could not. Outside, the wind carried the last echoes of hoofbeats away into the desert night. But Elias knew what those hoofbeats meant. The soldiers would be back, and the quiet life he'd built around her was already cracking, like thin ice over deep water. The soldiers didn't return the next day, nor the day after, but their absence did nothing to ease the weight pressing on the cabin. It was as though their visit had peeled away a layer of safety, leaving every sound sharp and every silence heavy. Elias found himself listening for hoofbeats even in his sleep. Taji changed too. Something had hardened in her eyes. She spent more time outside now, standing on the ridge above the canyon at dusk, looking south toward the mountains where the horizon burned red each evening. Elias watched her from the porch, coffee cup cooling in his hands. You thinking of running? He asked once, though he already knew the answer. Taji turned, her face unreadable. Run? No, not yet. Then what? She hesitated, then pointed toward the south. My people. He nodded slowly. You're hoping they'll come? She shook her head. No, they gone. Dead or hiding. Maybe none left. Her voice didn't tremble, but something in it made Elias's chest tighten. He'd seen that same hollow strength in men who'd lost everything but pride. That night, as the fire crackled low, she began to speak again. Not in English at first, but in her own language. The words soft and musical, full of ghosts. When she switched back to English, her eyes were on the flames. You ask. How I hurt, she said. How I find bullet. Elias looked up, startled. You don't have to. I want. She stared into the fire, face half shadowed. White soldiers come. Burn camp, take horses. Kill women. My brother, he fight. I fight too. Her voice dropped lower, rougher. One soldier. I kill." The words hung between them, heavier than the desert night. Elias felt them like a blow. She looked at him then, not pleading, not apologizing. Just waiting. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. In all the time he'd known her, he'd imagined her as a victim, a survivor swept up in someone else's war. But now that illusion burned away. "Was he the one who hurt your family?" Elias asked finally, his voice quiet. She nodded. "He killed my brother. I take his life. Then others come. Many guns, I fall. My people leave. They think I die." Her words were flat, stripped of emotion, but her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Elias stared at her across the fire. The soldier in him understood vengeance. He'd killed for less during the war. Orders shouted in chaos, faces he never saw again. But hearing it from her lips was different. It broke something inside him he hadn't known was fragile. "You could have told me sooner," he said softly. "You saved me." She whispered. "I not want." "Shame you." Elias stood, pacing to the door, the cool desert air biting against his skin. He felt torn clean in two, the man who'd saved her and the man who now had to reckon with what she'd done. "I don't know what to do with this, Taji," he said finally. "You kill one of them. They'll never stop hunting you." She rose slowly, her face calm but her eyes fierce. "Then I stop running." Elias turned back toward her. "What does that mean?" "It means I go back," she said simply. "To mountains. To find my people. To tell them stop fight. Stop die." He stared at her, stunned. "They'll kill you before you get the chance." "Maybe," she said. "But maybe not. Maybe they listen." Her words hit him like the edge of a knife, quiet, final, unshakable. He wanted to argue, to forbid her, but there was no ownership between them, no right to command. Only two souls who'd crossed paths in a storm neither had chosen. For a long time the only sound was the fire cracking. Then slowly Elias said, "You saved me too, you know." Taji frowned. "How?" He gave a small, sad smile. "Didn't even notice till now. But before you came along, I was just waiting to die out here. You made me remember what it's like to care about something." Taji studied him for a moment. Then she stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint scars at her temple, the reflection of firelight in her eyes. She touched his cheek lightly, almost curious. "Care is heavy," she said softly. "Yeah," Elias murmured. "It is." When she pulled her hand away, it felt like the beginning of an ending neither of them wanted to name. That night, Elias lay awake long after she'd gone to sleep, staring at the ceiling. Somewhere outside, coyotes called, thin, lonely voices echoing across the dark. He finally understood that saving her had been the easy part. Letting her go would be the real test. Elias Harper had made up his mind. He woke before dawn the next morning, the desert still cool and pale under a bruised sky. For hours he packed in silence. Jerky, hardtack, ammunition, a blanket, 2 canteens, and what little money he had left wrapped in an oilskin pouch. The saddle creaked softly under his hands, and each sound felt like a goodbye. Taji watched him from the doorway, her arms folded across her chest. "You go?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "We go," her eyes narrowed. "No, I go alone." "Not this time," Elias said, cinching the strap tight. "You try to cross that mountain by yourself, they'll find you before the sun's high. You don't know the trails north." "I do." "I not ask for guide," she said, voice sharp. "I know you didn't," he said evenly, "but I'm coming anyway." She stared at him for a long moment, torn between anger and something softer. Finally, she turned away, muttering a few words in Apache he didn't understand, though the tone said plenty. Elias smiled faintly. "You can curse me later. For now, help me pack." By mid-morning, the horse was ready. Elias had tied an old army bedroll behind the saddle, enough for 2 if they took turns walking. He spread a rough map on the table, tracing a line with his finger. "If we cut through the San Pedro Basin, we can make the Sierra Ancha in a week," he said. "There's water there and shelter. You can disappear till it's safe." "Disappear?" she echoed, the word heavy on her tongue. He met her eyes. "Start over, live, you deserve that." She stared at him in silence, her expression unreadable. Then she said softly, "You come too?" Elias hesitated. For a heartbeat, he let himself imagine it. A cabin high in the hills. Mornings filled with laughter instead of fear. Nights under clean stars. A life carved from peace instead of regret. But he knew better. He'd been a soldier too long, a man built for loneliness and ghosts. Maybe for a while, he said finally. But you need to build something that's yours, not just what I give you. Taji studied him as if trying to see the truth beneath his words. Why help me? She asked. He looked down at his calloused hands, at the map between them. Because once someone helped me when I didn't deserve it. Figured I'd pay it forward. That earned him the smallest of smiles, fleeting like sunlight through smoke. They spent the day preparing. Elias filled canteens from the creek and checked the rifle's chamber twice. Taji ground dried beans into powder for travel rations, her movements careful and practiced. For a brief while it almost felt like they were building a life together instead of planning an escape from death. As evening fell, the canyon turned gold and quiet. They sat outside the cabin watching the sun melt into the horizon. The world looked almost peaceful. Taji broke the silence first. When you fight, she said, you think it end? Elias frowned. You mean the war? She nodded. He let out a long breath. I thought it would. But wars don't end, not really. They just change shape. Move to new places. New people. She stared at him, eyes deep with understanding. Then why help me fight mine? He looked at her for a long time, his throat tight. Because maybe you can end yours. Maybe one of us can. The air between them shifted then. Heavy, fragile, charged with things neither of them dared to say. The last light of day touched her face, turning her skin to copper and her hair to black silk. Elias wanted to reach for her, to tell her that the thought of her leaving hollowed him out like an old tree. But he didn't, he couldn't. Instead, he said, We leave at dawn. Taji nodded once. Dawn. When she rose to go inside, he caught her hand. She didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to that touch. Rough calluses against soft skin, two lives suspended between past and future. Whatever happens out there, Elias said quietly, you remember one thing. You're not alone anymore. Taji met his eyes, her expression unreadable. Then she said almost in a whisper, No one is alone forever. Even ghosts find each other. When she went inside, Elias stayed on the porch staring out at the desert stars. They looked close enough to touch, cold and bright and unfeeling. Tomorrow they would ride north. Tomorrow he would try to save her again. But deep down, Elias feared the truth, that she didn't want saving, and that this journey would break his heart in ways bullets never could. The dawn came quietly, soft, gray, and fragile as breath on glass. Elias woke before the first light touched the canyon walls. The air was cold enough to make his fingers ache as he stirred the dying coals and set water to boil. He moved with careful purpose, as if the simple tasks of morning could hold off the storm building in his chest. Today they were supposed to leave, but some part of him already knew they wouldn't. He glanced toward the cot. It was empty, the blanket neatly folded. The space beside it, cold. For a heartbeat, his mind went blank. Then his stomach dropped. Taji? He called softly. No answer. He stepped outside. The world was still. No wind, no sound but the faint murmur of the creek. The horse was gone. Only a single set of footprints led away from the cabin, pressed deep into the sand and pointing south, toward the mountains. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He knew where she was going. She'd told him in every way that mattered. Still, he saddled the spare mule and rode hard, following her trail along the narrow canyon path. The sun began to rise behind him, bleeding gold over the rocks, throwing his shadow long and thin before him. He found her a few miles out, just as the land began to lift into the foothills. She'd stopped on a ridge looking toward the endless stretch of desert beyond, her homeland or what was left of it. Thought I told you we'd ride together, he said, breathless. Taji didn't turn. I cannot go north, she said softly. My place is there. Elias dismounted, his boots crunching in the sand. They'll kill you, Taji, you know that. Maybe. She turned then, and the rising sun caught her face, lighting it like fire and stone. But maybe they listen. Maybe I stop blood. Stop hate. You think you can fix what men like Boone started? Elias's voice cracked with disbelief and something dangerously close to fear. You'll just die trying. Taji's eyes softened, and for the first time he saw no anger there, only peace. You saved me, she said. But I not live for hiding. I live for purpose. Elias took a step closer. And what about me? Her expression faltered. You have your ghosts, she whispered. I have mine. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath. The wind still, the silence vast. Elias wanted to grab her shoulders, to shake her, to demand that she stay. He wanted to tell her that he'd finally found something worth holding on to, that she was it. But he saw the truth in her eyes before he could speak. She'd already chosen her path, and it wasn't him. He looked away, jaw tight. At least take the horse, he said roughly. She's faster. You'll need her more than I will. Taji hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth, the little wooden hawk he'd carved for her weeks before. He pressed it into her hand. Keep it, he said. Something to remind you that you can fly higher than they'll ever understand. She looked down at the carving, then at him. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she leaned forward and touched her forehead to his, a gesture so soft and fleeting it shattered him completely. When she pulled back, tears glimmered in her eyes. You heart-strong, she whispered, but too heavy. Let it rest. Before he could answer, she mounted the horse and turned toward the open desert. The wind caught her hair, sending it streaming behind her like a banner. Taji, Elias called, his voice breaking. She looked back once, just long enough to say, You gave me life. I give it meaning. Then she spurred the horse forward, vanishing into the sunrise. Elias stood there for a long time, the light washing over him, the emptiness settling deep and cold. When he finally returned to the cabin hours later, he found a small object on the table, her beaded bracelet woven from turquoise and bone, and a piece of wood carved with shaky English letters. You saved me. I stay to save others. He read it again and again until the letters blurred. The world outside hummed with heat and silence the same as before, yet everything felt changed. He sat down, the bracelet clutched in his hand, and whispered into the quiet, You broke my heart, girl. But maybe that's what it needed. The wind moved through the canyon then, soft as a sigh, and for the first time, Elias let himself believe she might actually make it. Weeks passed. The desert began to cool as summer slipped quietly into autumn. The nights turned sharp and the stars came closer, cold, brilliant, and unblinking. Elias Harper stayed in the canyon, though he didn't much know why anymore. The cabin felt hollow without her voice, her quiet footsteps, her shadow moving against the firelight. Sometimes he caught himself speaking aloud, as if she might answer. Sometimes he swore he heard her laugh in the wind. He kept himself busy, repairing the roof, mending tools, hunting when he could. But every task only carved the silence deeper. Her bracelet sat on the table where she'd left it, a small circle of turquoise and bone catching the light each morning. He couldn't bring himself to move it. Then one afternoon a trader passed through, a rough man with sunburned skin and the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much. He stopped for water, grateful for the shade. Been down through Apache country, the man said as he drank. Saw something strange down there. Thought maybe you'd want to hear it. Elias looked up sharply. What kind of strange? The trader shrugged. A woman, Apache. Said her name was Taji or something close to that. She came to one of the army camps down near Sonoita. Walked in alone. No weapons. Talked to both sides. Elias's heart thudded painfully. She alive? For a while, the trader said quietly. Heard she tried making peace. Said she'd seen enough blood for a lifetime. But soldiers don't listen to talk like that. They called her a spy. She didn't last long after that. The words hit Elias like a hammer. The room tilted, the sound of the wind vanishing from his ears. He stared at the trader, trying to see if there was mercy hidden in the man's expression, a mistake, a doubt, anything. But there was none. I'm sorry, the trader said after a moment. She was brave, though. Braver than most I've met. When the man rode on, the canyon fell silent again. Elias stood by the doorway long after the dust had settled, the bracelet heavy in his hand. He thought of her laughter during the rainstorm, of her voice learning English words, of the fierce light in her eyes when she said, Care is heavy. He'd known she would go, but not like that. That night, he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The hawk carving lay beside the bracelet, its wings half broken from where he'd carried it too long in his pocket. He ran his thumb along the grain and whispered, You said you'd stay to save others. Guess you did. The fire cracked softly, sending sparks drifting upward like tiny souls. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon, gentle this time, almost tender. Elias closed his eyes, letting it brush against his face. For the first time in a long while, the grief wasn't sharp. It was vast, endless, like the desert itself. Something you could live inside if you stopped fighting it. He rose before dawn the next morning, gathered his few belongings, and saddled the mule. Before leaving, he placed the hawk and the bracelet on the table side by side, tokens of two lives that had met in the dust and changed each other forever. He paused at the door, looking back once. The cabin was quiet, the air inside golden with early light. It felt less like an ending and more like the final page of a story he'd never meant to write. As he rode out of the canyon, the wind carried whispers across the stone, faint, musical, like the echo of a woman's voice. He didn't know if it was real, but he smiled anyway. "Fly high, Taji," he murmured. "You earned it." The trail wound upward toward the mountains, and as the first light spilled over the horizon, Elias felt something loosen in his chest, not joy, not peace exactly, but something close enough to keep riding. Behind him, the desert stretched endless and wild, cradling both the living and the dead in its silent hands, and though his heart was broken, it beat steady, carrying her name in every breath, every step, every mile of the wide, unforgiving world.